Alright, I'm here to take a look at the RX 7900 XTX Taichi White Edition. There's a lot of very off-color jokes I could make about that. Let's not do that. This is actually a really nice card. This is probably the nicest 7900 XTX that you can get. Just look at this design, this form, fit, and finish. It's got the Taichi, it's got the gears and all this kind of stuff. It's a nice powder coat of a white metal backplate, and look at all those heat pipes. This thing is built for heat dissipation. And as we saw in the other video that I did, you can juice these things to 600 watts. I get why AMD didn't do that. I mean, everybody wants to be power efficient. This thing is very quiet out of the box, but if you ramp the fans, change the fan curve, you can make it very cool and quiet, or you can have it sit at about 80, 85 degrees C, but basically be inaudible. So I thought we should do a build and take a deeper look at the performance and all this other kind of stuff. But since this is white, we've got an opportunity to talk about white builds, because I've been running a long-term experiment here at level 1, because white cases age weird. So let's dive in, let's take a look at the performance of this, but let's also get started on our build. Now the GPU part of it, that's easy, right? I mean, it's the 7900 XTX. There's a lot of people that are building to an aesthetic, and this definitely has that aesthetic. I mean, it's got RGB, but you could configure the RGB to be a nice, tasteful white if you want, or blue or green or whatever. It doesn't matter. For the case, I've selected the Be Quiet Dark Base 802. Why? Well, because I already had that one. And also, because I've had it a while, so we can see how white cases age. It looks so fancy! Oh. So yeah, you know, we're going to use the Taichi Carrera. For this build, I would recommend the X670E Taichi Carrera, which is a nice white marble finish. And if you're a modder, one important thing to pay attention to is that they get the marbleized coloring. It makes a nice surface for putting your own custom vinyl on it. So if you wanted to design and print your own custom vinyl and then stick it to your motherboard like decals, the Carrera also makes an excellent choice for that, even though the heat sinks are still pretty functional. Now, let's have a segue for just a moment to talk about white cases and how they age. You see, when you have powder-coated white metal and white plastic, they age differently. Plastic in general ages differently. Yeah, white plastic ages differently when it's 20 or 30 years old too, and you can better believe that this is going to look very different in 20 or 30 years as opposed to like 3 or 4 or 2 or whatever. You can see that the plastic front here is a little different than the metal on the side panel. And that's just a fact of life with how cases age. You can even see it just flipping around these metal covers that go in the bottom. The thing that I love about this case is that if you want airflow or if you want quietness, it comes with the panels for both. This is the front. But see, Be Quiet knows that the plastic is going to age differently, and they try not to make it super obvious. So this could be plastic, but they've actually done it as metal. I've got the mesh front on. And so this is also metal with a little bit of plastic honeycomb behind it. But if you opted to go for that front, meaning that you don't have air intake in the front, or at least not as much because it's going to draw air from smaller vent panels, let's say, it's less noticeable, the contrast between the metal and plastic sides. And in fact, when you look at it dead on from the front, you just have this mesh on the front as opposed to the plastic trim. But if you're looking at it from my angle, I'm seeing the metal side panel here and the plastic, and you can really see the color difference. You can also see the color difference between, say, the top panels of the case, which are aging a little differently than the rest of the metal. But I like the modularity. Like, I don't think that Be Quiet should make these things out of metal. I think this is reasonable aging. Don't want our GPU to heat, so I'm just going to go ahead and swap that back out now. This cover goes in the bottom under the GPU, or you can take it out so that the GPU will breathe better and you can draw more air in from the bottom. This is something you can decide in your build. Now, Be Quiet makes some other good cooling solutions, but I really think that the 1-2 punch of amazing quiet cooling here is to go with Arctic's 420mm cooler. This is one of the few cases, I mean, it's a tower case, it's not compact, but it is relatively small for as much as you can do with it. And it'll fit a 420mm radiator. I've got that in here from Arctic, and that will cool anything. You could run a blast furnace in this case and it will be fine. Of course, the 7950X is not a blast furnace, but if you want it to run completely quietly, silently, then yeah, you could put your 420mm cooler in here and you're good to go, because Arctic, that cooler, it's incredible. And then I've rounded out the rest of the case fans with Be Quiet cooling fans, because Be Quiet knows how to make a quiet fan. They be quiet. For the power supply, I'm also using the new Dark Power 13 from Be Quiet. This is because it's got a PCIe 5 connector, and yeah, the GPU doesn't use a PCIe 5 connector, but given that I'm using this system for testing and other things, it's nice to have the convenience. The Taichi 7900 XTX, it only uses 3 8-pin connectors. So this has got plenty of power for that GPU and our 7950X at 850 watts. The Dark Power 13 also has a 3-pin connector here. It's the OCK, and so you can notify your power supply that you're doing overclocking and make it not turn off automatically. I don't know, OCK is a Be Quiet feature, and I haven't really delved into that much, so maybe something to check. Overcurrent protection, but programmable. This is an 80 plus titanium rated power supply, and it's got an actual Be Quiet fan on the inside of the power supply and this nice mesh front, which lowers air turbulence and noise and whatever, or so Be Quiet says. Oh, and in case you're worried that you're wasting some of your power that's available in the power supply because, you know, you're using a GPU that doesn't have the 600 watt connector, no, the labeling on the front of the power supply actually tells you how, you know, the delivery stages that the thing is actually connected to for your different connectors. So it's shared with the power, like the normal size power connectors over on the other side, so it's fine. Now I'm also putting together quite the collection of white cases to see how they age. I've got the new Fractal Torrent cases, and Fractal really is planning for this by making as much of the case as possible plastic. The front, top, and side trim, they're all plastic. Really only the back mesh at the back of the case where you can't see it, and the one side panel are metal. And what I can see, these are aging pretty well. I've got both the Torrent and the Torrent Compact in test. Similar with the White Meshify 2. It's more mixed metal and plastic than the Torrent, but it looks like it's aging well, although I don't think I've had the Meshify 2 long enough to really say for sure. Cooler Master's inexpensive half 500 case is also holding up well. It's an all-metal design with the white plastic front panel, but I can tell the white pigments are aging differently, as we saw in our Be Quiet Dark Base 802. Other companies avoid the use of white plastic, like Lee & Lee in the 011 Dynamic, and NZXT, for example. They have our little NZXT case here in the front and sides and top. Those are all metal. All the plastic bits are black. So they've cleverly used black plastic and white metal to avoid the white aging problem. Clever gal. And just using all metal components, that is a valid strategy for dealing with how white ages differently depending on if it's metal or plastic. I've also got the OG Fractal Define White. This is the first case where Fractal really put a lot of thought and work into trying to make sure that the plastic and the metal will age roughly the same. And this is also holding up surprisingly well. It's got about as much tint difference as the Cooler Master or our, Silent Base 802 has, but it's not bad. It's not as unattractive as the Mac Mini. It's also not quite as old as the Mac Mini, but this is a problem with white builds as they age. But let's face it, you weren't going to have this computer for more than 2 years anyway, right? First world problems. Alright, let's get our GPU mounted and then let's do our performance breakdown. Now for our SSD, I'm using a Solidigm P44 Pro. P44 Pro goes head to head with Samsung for less cost. The 2TB model is a steal. Really wish they'd come out with the 4TB model. What are they thinking? We need it now. I mean, while flash is cheap. Nobody's buying flash memory. Yeah, nobody wants a 1 or 2TB flash drive anymore. They want 4TB. I know it makes no sense counterintuitively economically, but if you can buy a 4TB drive for $250, wouldn't you rather sell that than $200 2TB drives? I mean, come on. Okay, the P44 Pro is not quite that cheap, but the P41 is, and with Solidigm software, it's fast. It's almost that cheap. It's close. It's getting close. Solidim's surprisingly good. For a memory kit, I'm using G.Skill Trident Z. DDR5 6000 is the sweet spot for AMD's platform. Can you believe this machine is on? It's madness. It's more quiet than the air conditioning. Okay, so our out-of-the-box performance with the Taichi 7900 XTX, this is an OC edition, which means it's overclockable, but but the out-of-the-box defaults are basically the same performance targets as a 7900 XTX. And when we start to see that breakdown in the benchmarks, but stay tuned because it gets interesting. At Borderlands 3, we can do about 300 FPS with our 7900 XTX at 1080p. At 1440p, we can manage about 244 FPS and 134 FPS at 4K. Shadow of the Tomb Raider, 300 FPS at 1080p, 264 FPS at 1440p, and 161 FPS at 4K. At 1080p in the Callisto Protocol, we can expect 256 FPS, 184 FPS at 1440p, and 114 FPS at 4K. Deus Ex Mankind Divided, 206 FPS, 205 FPS at 1440p. Yes, there is no performance difference in Deus Ex Mankind Divided because there's engine problems when you're going over 200 FPS. And 4K, you can do 145 FPS. So I'd say that there's engine problems even at 1440p. You can play Deus Ex Mankind Divided at 4K, but that's a really old game at this point. For artificial benchmarks, it looks pretty good. Firestrike, Firestrike Extreme, and Time Spy all pull well ahead of the reference model. And keep in mind that this is the same power targets and same performance and temperature targets as the reference model. So just having the giant heat pipe 3-slot cooler, and it is 3 true slots, which means that you could use the 4th slot. It's not overhanging the 3rd slot by even a little bit. It actually will breathe pretty well, and it won't overhang if you're using this in a dual GPU configuration and the rare motherboard that actually has 2 X8 slots. It is breathable, just barely. Now let's talk power targets. Now my GPU might be more overclockable than your GPU, but what you can do is you can basically just open up the Adrenaline software and dial up the power target and then just let the card do its own thing. You can go Rage Mode. Rage Mode is a thing that is supported in the Adrenaline software. If you do it that way, you're not likely to encounter stability issues, or you're less likely to encounter stability issues, and you can probably expect 3 to 5% more performance, maybe a little bit more. The biggest benefit from doing that kind of an overclock and having this giant of a cooler is first and foremost noise, and secondarily, performance. And it's not the raw number off the line performance, meaning your average FPS. It's more to do with the 1% lows and the 0.1% lows. You see this in games like Callisto Protocol because it's, there's a jump scare and then a million monsters come out and all of a sudden there's a whole bunch of stuff going on. And if your machine hitches during one of those encounters because suddenly there's a whole bunch of stuff going on screen, it's very jarring and off-putting. The fact that this card, when you unleash the power targets, can burst to do whatever it wants, well, yeah, it's going to maintain 100 plus FPS at 4K, but then when there's a whole bunch of stuff going down on screen, for at least a second or 2 or 3 or 5, the card can burst much higher. This is also a reason why it's maybe useful to run at the refresh rate of your display. So it really does make sense to try to run your GPU at a frame rate that connects with your monitor. It can also improve latency and everything else, and AMD has a lot of technologies for that, which are awesome. So in terms of gameplay with the 7900 XTX, it'll basically do whatever you want. Ray tracing is really the weakest spot, the weakest part of the GPU. It really can't do 4K ray tracing. You can do ray tracing at 1080p in most titles. Some titles like Shadow of the Tomb Raider, it's not a really fully ray traced scene, it's just using it for some of the lighting effects, and so it's easy on the ray tracing engine, and games like that it'll perform great. Older titles that have been remastered, like Quake 2, you can do ray tracing in Quake 2 on the 7900 XTX. It works well, and then I can't believe this ancient game from a million years ago looks this good. That's fun. It's a fun bit of nostalgia. But this card also isn't $2,000. So it's nice that it performs as well as it does. For basically everything but ray tracing, it dominates. It really does. It's incredible. And the fact that it's got the heat pipes is what keeps it cool. In fact, the acoustic performance of this card far outshines AMD's own reference solution. Basically what we did was we set up the microphone about 12 inches from the GPU, and then we just ran a whole bunch of benchmarks. Set a fixed performance target to try to get as close as we possibly can for Firestrike performance. Let Firestrike run over and over and over again for an hour. Measure the noise coming off of the card. You can also check the GPU hotspots. I mean, AMD's reference design didn't really do super bad in terms of hotspot, but it is over a 10°C difference with the Taichi having a max hotspot temperature of like 84, which isn't bad. It's pretty good. But it's also silent. And the silence is what you're paying for. The fan design, the aesthetics, everything else, this card would work great horizontally or vertically. If you've got a vertical GPU mount and you want to show it off, all that's going to work in here great. So again, 7900 XTX. It can game, and it doesn't cost $2,000. It can run everything at 4K at over 100 FPS. What more do you want? I'm Wondless Level 1. I'm signing out. You can find me in the Level 1 forums.